What kind of soul will you have? What kind of person will you be? Will you do whatever it takes to get what you want? Or will you accept even great suffering in order to do what is right? Everything else in your life will flow from how you answer that question. The Bible gets at this very same issue, but it does so not so much through philosophical argumentation as through the prophetic language of idolatry and right worship. For the biblical authors, it's never a question of religion versus secularism. First of all, they were not trading what we call religion. And secondly, they knew that there really is no pure secularism. Rather, they understood that the world is basically divided between those who worship the true God and those who indulge in idolatry or false worship. Even in our supposedly secular society, we can appreciate the appropriateness of the biblical terminology. For everyone, even the most secular, the most unchurched, operates under the aegis of something he or she considers supreme, some summum bonum, some highest good. No one would in fact get out of bed in the morning unless he believed in some value that's ultimately motivating his actions and decisions. Now, this might be bodily pleasure or fame or material goods or one's country or one's family, but if it's functioning as the prime mover of a person's activity, it's playing the role of God and is being effectively worshiped. So, the biblical form of the question that we've been considering is, whom or what do you worship? What's the highest value for you? Again, everything else in your life will flow from how you answer that question. There are numberless biblical texts that would be ad rem here, but I'd like to look at a particularly clarifying and dramatic one, namely the scene described in the first book of Kings regarding Elijah and the priests of Baal. We recall the setting. Elijah had challenged King Ahab for his worship of false gods proposed by his wife Jezebel. He subsequently challenged the avatars of those deities to a kind of duel on Mount Carmel. Standing alone against the 450 devotees of Baal, he proposed that he and they should erect altars to their respective deities and see who would respond. All morning long, the priests cried out, I'm quoting now from the scripture, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice, and there was no answer. At this point, Elijah mocked them. Again, I'm quoting from the scriptures. "Cry aloud. Surely he's a god. Either he's meditating, or he's wandered away, or he's on a journey. Perhaps he's asleep and must be awakened." Close quote. Then, in their frenzy and frustration, the priests of Baal proceeded to cut themselves with swords and lances until the blood gushed over them. But it was to no avail. Then, of course, Elijah calls out to the Lord, and the fire falls, consuming the sacrifice and vindicating the prophet. Now, I want to emphasize, this is much more than simply a jingoistic story of my God's bigger than your God. In point of fact, it's an incomparably rich presentation of the dynamics of true and false worship. The altar erected to Baal should be taken as standing for all the ways in which we order the infinite longing of our hearts to something less than God. When we do this, and fellow sinners in this space, we all know this, when we do this, the fire never falls, because merely worldly things cannot, even in principle, satisfy our hungry souls. And furthermore, when we persist in worshiping falsely, we find ourselves in short order caught in an addictive pattern, hopping, as it were, obsessively around the altars of pleasure or power or fame, desperately seeking a satisfaction that will never come. The self harm inflicted by the hapless priests of Baal speaks eloquently to the self-destructive quality to which any addict can attest. And all of us sinners are addicts. Only when the fondest desire of our soul is directed to the infinite God will the fire fall and addiction be avoided. The question is simple. At which altar will you worship? Your whole life will unfold, for weal or for woe, from that decision. Now, if we want to see the place where Plato and Elijah come together, we need look no further than the cross of Jesus, which St. Paul described as a divine weakness stronger than human strength and a divine folly wiser than human wisdom. Where could we find a clearer instantiation of the principle that it's better to suffer injustice than to commit it than in Jesus crucified? Sinless, blameless, he nevertheless took upon himself all the sin of the world. Hatred, cruelty, stupidity, violence, institutional corruption, betrayal, denial, all of it. But rather than lashing out and answering violence, he said, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Laboring under the full weight of human injustice and wickedness, his soul remained inviolate. And that's why, to the consternation of all the advocates of might makes right, from Callistes to Nietzsche, we hold up the cross and we say, again ironically with Pontius Pilate, Ecce homo, behold the true man. My intellectual hero, St. Thomas Aquinas, said that if we want to live a happy life, we should love what Jesus loved on the cross and despise what Jesus despised on the cross. Now, what did he despise? But all those objects of false worship to which we tend to erect altars. Many of us worship wealth, but on the cross he was utterly poor, stripped naked. Many of us worship pleasure, but on the cross he was at the limit of suffering, both physical and psychological. Many of us worship power, but on the cross he was nailed in place, unable even to move. Many of us worship honor, but on that terrible cross, he was the object of scorn and ridicule. In short, the crucified Lord said no as radically as possible to the idols. And what did he love on the cross? He loved doing the will of his Father. And therefore, the cross functioned as the altar on which the sacrifice of his life to the Father took place, and that's why the fire fell.